Hello everyone. I haven't done a book review for a little while, so I just read a book that I've been finding quite fascinating. It's called Unsettled Matters by Tom Bleeker, and it's about the life and death of Bruce Lee. So just tell you a little bit about this chap, Tom Bleeker. So he's basically somebody who actually trained with Bruce Lee back in the 60s and trained privately with him. He's actually somebody who was involved in Hollywood, was a screenwriter as well, so knew a lot of these people that Bruce Lee knew, people like Steve McQueen and Sterling Silliphant and all these people that were big in the 60s. And he basically was around, and then when Bruce Lee died, he wrote a book with Bruce Lee's widow, Linda Lee, called The Bruce Lee Story, which was the basis of the motion picture called Dragon. He also, obviously, well, not obviously, but while he was doing this, got romantically involved with Bruce Lee's widow and ended up getting married to her. So he was actually married to Bruce Lee's widow for 2 years, and knew Bruce Lee's sons as well, Brandon Lee and Shannon Lee. So this is something that, this is a person who was quite intimately connected with the life of Bruce Lee, and would I say probably knew a lot about this. This book is the result of over 4 years of intense investigative research that led him from the back alleys of Hong Kong to obscure court documents which were uncovered in Los Angeles and Seattle. So it says on the back of the blurb, on the discover why both the author and this publication company have been threatened with massive civil lawsuits if we dare publish the contents of this book. Now, the funny thing is about this book is there isn't a single picture of Bruce Lee in this, which probably has something to do with copyright and things like that. And on the inside, there isn't a single illustrated picture. And usually books about Bruce Lee, what sells them is that, they've got pictures of Bruce Lee on it and all that kind of thing. There's not a single picture on it except other than the picture of the author. And this is a picture of the author from, looks like about 20, 30 years back. He himself is a martial artist and practices. So, what did I think of this book? Well, I love this book. I couldn't put it down, but that's because I'm a big Bruce Lee fan. I've been a big Bruce Lee fan probably since the early 70s when I saw him, and then I kind of got into martial arts myself. So I can see why I would read it. But I think if you weren't a fan of Bruce Lee, you might also want to read it because it reads very much like a kind of crime thriller. And the story about Bruce Lee's death very much is that, he was a star who's about to hit it big, almost hit it big, and literally about 3 or 4 weeks before the release of the movie Enter the Dragon, which went on to become a huge huge mega blockbuster hit. I mean, it's probably, for the amount of money that it cost, it's probably made more money than almost any other movie. It's a huge blockbuster for what it cost and everything. And Bruce Lee died literally about 3-4 weeks before the start of that, in very odd circumstances. Basically, he went to a friend's house, female friend's house, to talk about a script, took a painkiller, and then had a hyper-allergic reaction to a painkiller and died and never woke up. And what is interesting thing that he says is he thinks that the amazing miracle of the story is that people actually believed that story for years. So when he looked into the case, because there were so many odd things that, you don't realize. And, they say that thing that you shouldn't get to know your idols too much, because then, they're always going to disappoint. But, there are things about this that I realized that, Bruce Lee was obviously, he was out in Hong Kong. He was having an affair with this particular actress, maybe not the only one. He was taking steroids. He was taking drugs. He was taking cocaine, which has only come out in the last kind of 5 years. But he was taking marijuana, which is not unusual back in the 70s for people of a Hollywood kind of mindset from that thing. And there were some health issues he was having, even at that age. Although he was known as the king of kung fu and the fittest, he was actually labeled as the fittest man in the world at that time. But he was taking anabolic steroids, and because of that and at those times the anabolic steroids weren't even illegal. People like Arnold Schwarzenegger was taking them and things like that. And admits to that. But apparently, he was having these roid rages and going into rages, and his skin was changing color, and there were all sorts of other things going on. Also, according to this, Bruce Lee never left a will. So his wife, his widow, poor lady, was actually almost stuck with 2 kids and no money. And the people who were controlling the purse strings, weren't actually giving any money out. Some of them were big movie moguls in Hong Kong, and she, the Hong Kong police at that time apparently was well known as being something very corrupt. The triads were involved. Triads were involved and wanted money from most of the entertainment industry figures at that time as well. And apparently Bruce Lee wasn't playing ball because he was kind of brought up in California and thought, why? But sometimes things don't work like that. Anyway, there's all sorts of other things that I didn't know, and I'm a big Bruce Lee fan. Like, for example, Bruce Lee's house got given to Bruce Lee's butler, who hasn't said a word to this day about why he got the house. He just said that Bruce Lee trusted him, and yet his kids didn't get it and his wife didn't get it. So there's some strange things going on. The lady whose house he was found in went into seclusion quite soon after that, and almost became a monk, a female monk. Bruce Lee's widow didn't get a penny. Apparently Bruce Lee was penniless when he actually died, and really didn't have much money to his name. Eventually there were big long court battles, and I think people decided that she should get some money. So she did get some money, but probably nothing like what she maybe should have. And then obviously she's, there's the whole cult of Bruce Lee and this whole industry that's built up around him, which she's then obviously used to make some financial gain from, and why not? And his family, and why shouldn't they? But essentially what comes out of this is that the author writes this book very painstakingly. I mean, he talks about all sorts of documents and financial transactions, and I couldn't even keep up with them. Some of the lawyers who made money from the case, who were involved in the case, actually made money from things like merchandising. So one of the lawyers who was involved, or one of the people involved, actually, they started merchandising some of Bruce's images, and they got like 25%. It's incredible. Imagine having the merchandising rights to Prince or something, and another lawyer that's involved gets 25% or something. It seems incredible. So, but the author's idea is that Bruce Lee was taking steroids, which really messed up his system, and probably contributed to liver failure and other things, and kidney failure. And also the idea was that he may well have been poisoned, and he had plenty of enemies that wanted to get rid of him, because Bruce Lee was a cash cow for one of the Hong Kong film the Hong Kong studio that basically produced his movies. And Bruce Lee basically, once he'd made Into the Dragon, thought, that's it, I'm off. I'm going to Hollywood and I'm going to leave these people. So a lot of them weren't very happy. The triads weren't very happy because they were losing a potential money spinner, and they felt that they'd been disrespected. So there's lots of things going on. So the official narrative that Bruce Lee took a painkiller and fittest man in the world was hyper allergic to this painkiller just sounds really, really odd. And actually, when you read this, you think, yeah, that doesn't make much sense. And I never quite bought that. But this is Unsettled Matters, The Life and Death of Bruce Lee by Tom Bleeker. He wrote it ages ago. As far as I know, he didn't have it write this with the blessings of the Bruce Lee family. But you can tell that this is somebody who knows a lot about Bruce Lee, who has done a lot of research, and he's kind of come out with what he felt was the truth. It is coming out now that Bruce Lee was taking drugs, cocaine as well as other things, which is not unusual for that time. But obviously we now know, and also taking steroids, that has an effect on the body. So a lot of these things kind of coming out, and yeah, it's that thing about, sometimes it's not good to know your idols too well because they're gonna fall short. But I suppose the bottom line is that Bruce Lee was a highly talented man who had his faults. He was only human at the end of the day, and he was under a huge amount of pressure and stress at a very young age. This guy was only 32 when he died. Only 32 when he died. So the pressures of stardom, or imminent stardom, pressures of Hollywood, pressures of having a young family, pressure of having to, get your, make your money in another place. He had to go back to Hong Kong. All these other things, obviously, and maybe then having to rely on medication, which people like Michael Jackson and Prince did as well. And these things killed these people eventually. And there were people willing to provide them. Yes men who were willing to provide these for these people. So it's a shame, but it reads quite good. It reads like a bit of a crime novel, and if you're into that kind of thing, you probably enjoy this. Okay, thank you. That's my first review for a little while.